I am delighted to have you join us for an evening of myth, memory, and early sports history here in Boston for the Boston Game. At the MHS, we host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of history, and we welcome everyone to draw upon our collections for a richer understanding of the past. Now, one of my jobs here is to oversee the research department, and it is such a thrill to see researchers coming into this room. This room is generally the reading room when it's not converted for a program, and you see these projects grow. And they grow from the primary sources into really wonderful books. And in fact, tonight's program is based on a project that started in this room as a reading room. So we're thrilled to have our speakers back to show what they have found and written about. It's my pleasure to welcome them back, and I'm going to introduce them, and then we shall get going. Kevin Tallec Marston is a professor at the International Center for Sports Studies in Switzerland. His work has focused on the history of sports in relation to youth, international relations, the Olympic Games, ethnicity, memory and monuments, and legacy. Mike Cronin is the academic director of Boston College in Ireland and a professor of history in the Irish Studies program at Boston College, where he has pioneered the study of sports history in Ireland. Both Professors Marston and Cronin are also visiting research fellows and faculty at the International Center for Sport History and Culture at De Montfort University in the United Kingdom. Our program tonight will be moderated by MHS advisor Louisa Thomas, a staff writer for The New Yorker, whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, and Vogue, and Racket, and several Best American Sports Writing anthologies. Their conversation is about to get going. They're going to pause at 6:45 to take questions from our audience members. And if you're online, just type questions into the Q&A, and we'll read them on your behalf. And if you're in the room, please raise your hand, and we'll bring the microphone to you. I know enough about sports to know that this is not the correct sport this is coming from, but I've always wanted to start a program by saying, play ball.
And thank you all for coming here. I'm delighted to be in conversation today. And I wanted to start off by asking our speakers about this ball, because this is fundamentally there's a little bit of a mystery at the heart of this wonderful book. And it begins with an artifact. Could you describe this one particular ball that you open the book with?
So the ball, perfect timing, the ball. I went to visit this ball. It's kept now by Historic New England in their off-site storage. And I drove up there, and duly the box was wheeled out to me, and out came the ball. And it clearly was made of rubber back in the day, but it's all kind of collapsed in on itself. And when you tap it, you can see it feels more like hollow wood. Rubber has perished. But what's remarkable about the ball is it was given to the predecessor of Historic New England in 1922. And when you look at the ball, it has on it some names, it has a crest, it has an opposing team, perhaps, and then some times on it. And when these men handed the ball over to the museum in 1922, their claim was this was a ball we played with in November 1863. So the ball that now sits in Historic New England is 160 years old, which is quite remarkable for footballs to survive. I'm sure none of you have footballs you played with when you were kids. And especially this is early technology. Charles Goodyear had patented the idea of a rubber football in 1855. So this is almost one of the first balls there. And it's regularly, if you go online, I appreciate online is not always true, but it's regularly cited as the first football in the world, or the oldest football. And it really set us thinking about what was this ball? What was it used for? Why have these men kept it? Of all the things from their childhood, why has one of them kept a ball from 1863 till 1922? And then what does this ball symbolize? And what history does it tell us? So that's where the story began, with a ball.
There are a number of things that you said in your answer which we can tease out to look at the different avenues that your research must have gone down. You have the sort of material interests. So there's a story, you mentioned Goodyear. So there's partly a story about the standardization of a ball, right? It's a technological story. A story about maybe the standardization of play. A story about a group of people organizing and then later becoming interested in their organization. And then, as you say, like, it's not like the ball they played with when they were in high school or whatever, because it has like gold lettering on it and a crest and stuff, and you presume that they were not like kicking around this gold-plated ball in the Boston Common, right? So it's also a story about memorialization.
Yeah.
And I was curious, as you sit with this ball, which of those different narratives seemed most urgent to you from the start, and which of them presented themselves as you went further and further into your research?
Well, I think as an artifact, the ball is a fascinating piece of material history, that's for sure. And it connects to the questions of memorialization. It links to a number of the things that you mentioned, Louisa, the development of a culture of play, a leisure culture in the 19th century, the development of an association culture that we see, and maybe Kit will be happy because there is a baseball link in this story. So a lot of the basis for the association culture that is used by the men that were involved in this history is linked to their involvement in early baseball, early Massachusetts baseball. So there is a connection there as well. But I suppose, to return to your question about which of those threads were the first to really speak to us, I think as we dove into the actual artifacts and the material, it became quite clear that there's a lot of people involved in this, a lot of stories, a lot of narratives of individual complex lives and relationships between many people in what was 19th century elite social Boston. And I think the biographical element was absolutely fascinating. There's perhaps a part of this story which we didn't put in the book, actually, because it was too long. There are 52 biographies that we did that are going on an appendix at UMass Press that will be online. That detail actually the lives of the men that are included in this club.
Many of whose names, no doubt, will be very recognizable to people familiar with the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, because this is, Brahmin Boston Society. One thing that is interesting is, to me, as you look at the people in the book, a lot of them are coming out of a certain class, but not all of them, right? I mean, there's an element here, and this is only occurring to me. In fact, it only occurred to me as Kit was giving these introductions, and he mentioned that you have associations in the UK, and I was thinking there's also a class story here, and that was obvious when we're talking about leisure and Brahmin Boston and Boston Common and all these things. But there's also a story here about athletics and class, and in this particular moment, the semi-professionalization of sport, and what does it mean to be an athletic young person. And I'm actually curious about how your prior research into sport and culture informed the way you approached this research.
If you're involved in sports history, one of the big questions is, how does sport emerge? And while you do have clear-cut cases like with basketball and Naismith, you can literally say somebody sat down and invented this sport. But for most sports, it's a very long evolution. So when you look back, certainly within the UK, in England, you look at the boarding schools. And it's what games the boys develop in a very localized setting. And also in the US, or certainly this part of the US, 1860s, Boston doesn't have boarding schools. It has schools such as Dixwell's, which is a school we're talking about, where they are training boys for the Harvard entrance exam. So that class thing's very interesting, that they're not all rich, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are from Beacon Hill, they're from Milton, they're from affluence. So that's the sort of social class story starts going one way, understanding who these boys, later men, are. But then also I think the one thing that Kevin Ironsney hit upon when you get the ball is it's a round ball. And if you read other accounts from different schools in the broader sort of northeast of the US at the time, people who've wrote about their games they played as young boys, the balls always burst. It's a new technology, they're not reliable. A good kick, pop. So when you look at the comparison, what is the sort of oldest team sport that emerged from schools in the UK? It's rugby, but why? Rugby is a handling game. You're literally looking after the ball. You're not thumping it with your feet and trying to get it 60 yards down a pitch. So clearly the whole idea that these boys in this club that emerged out of Dixwell schools are playing with a round ball begin to start asking questions about what kind of game were they playing, because round denotes kicking more than handling. So all those sort of little questions start coming out. And the fact that we have, again, this small elite school whose only job is to get you into Harvard, another elite institution. And it starts telling you stories about who they are, what their kind of social class is.
And this becomes particularly interesting because we can look at different time frames that the book is interested in, right? There is the 1863 game. And so you're partly telling a story about that particular year and that game and the years that led up to it, which of course, 1863 is not a year without consequence, let's say. We're in the middle of a civil war in this country, in which many of the families that are producing these young boys who are playing are intimately involved. And at the same time, there is another year of great consequence in this book, which is the year in which that ball emerges into the public eye. Can you tell me about what happened in 1922?
So in 1922, so the ball, as you said, Louisa, is a historic ball, an artifact from 1863. And then as the story develops, I'll insert one intermediary date in there, is 1906, when a book is published that is on display upstairs that you'll see afterwards, called Old Boston Boys, and the games they played, by James DeWolf Lovett, who was one of these boys playing and running around Boston Common as a teenager in 1863, while the country was being fought over and bled over. And in 1906, they organized a dinner with some remaining friends and just old friends. And they come together and essentially try to paint a picture of memory. That's the book there. And that's the list of subscribers with many illustrious names that you will obviously all know. And we have the list of school kids from Dixwell School there. All of this is from the collections here at Mass Historical Society. And so in 1906, this dinner is held, and they write a book. And the book is designed to be a memoir for the local community, if you will, and it only becomes a piece of interesting history when it's printed out twice subsequently to that, 1907, 1908, and it then gets donated into libraries, and it gets published in a much broader sense with Little and Brown Publishing Company. And that brings the ball into view, because there's an image in this book which actually has the ball. It's the first historic image that we have of the ball. There's no historical evidence that we have seen the ball before 1906. And that ball is then kept again for another 14 years before 1922, when it is then subsequently donated to the Boston Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And that's a moment, obviously, in the 1920s. The country is going through a vast amount of change. We have, on the end of 40 years of massive immigration and migration and assimilation, and the country's identity is being completely reimagined at that point. And so part of the culture in which this story is growing is very much the antiquarian movement that Mass Historical Society participated in, obviously, but other institutions across the city where it was all about preserving the history of Old New England and Old Boston. And so 1922 is a moment of donation, and when you read through the bulletin of the SPNEA at the time, you have a whole host of donations of all sorts of things, curtains, silverware, but you also have a ball. And that's, the ball is where it then becomes a publicly visible object that can enter essentially the historical record.
And what's the deal? Why does the ball matter? I mean, and this is a broader question, like who cares? There's this game that was played in 1863, who cares? Like why did this grip you so?
I think there's a few things you've got to remember. I think one thing is this game is being played, these boys play the game between 1862 and 1865. So as you say, it's a civil war. But that's young boys, that's what young boys do. They're going to occupy their time when they're not at school, they play this game on Boston Common. And I think it's interesting, as Kevin said, by the time you get to the 20s and this idea of recalling and remembering an old Boston, what are we really talking about here? A pre-mass immigration Boston. They are beginning to memorialize what they did. And the ball, in a way, they are giving the ball to the museum because they're kind of beginning to argue that we gave the game to the world. And it might only be an old ball they played with at boys, but by the time they're in their 60s and 70s by this point, they are deciding, because of other things that are going on in the world, this ball has a bigger meaning than just a childhood artifact.
One of the other things that's happening in the 1920s is that American football is becoming entrenched in American culture in a way that was new, right? I mean, there's this great detail for anyone who has gone to Harvard or Yale or knows insufferable people who went to Harvard or Yale, that Harvard and Yale are forever bickering about their superiority. And the James Naismith of football is commonly known to be this man named Walter Camp, and Walter Camp came out of Yale. And just at that time, Walter Camp's story is he's being honored as the father of football, and these like old Harvard guys are like, wait a second, right? I mean, can you one of the wonderful things about the story is that it works on many different levels, right?
Yeah.
And there's a certain kind of like wonderful pettiness.
I think, I mean, to be honest, it goes back to the point you asked about the meaning of the ball. You have to look at that trajectory that two things are happening when the boys are playing on Boston Common. They're playing with their round ball, but because of the ban on college football games, because of its unruliness, Harvard, Yale, etc., had all outlawed football in 1860. And football doesn't reappear on campuses till the 1870s. So that big bang moment of the McGill-Harvard game, the agreements and discussions between Yale, Harvard, Rutgers, and so on about what will be the intercollegiate game, they're figuring that out, either side of a college ban. What's the only things that existed in that gap? The games on Boston Common. So this huge sense of ownership that Boston, in particular Harvard, has over the future of the game, will it be? Because by this point, across the Atlantic, you've got the Football Association. The game of soccer has been organised and the rules put down, and it's taken off. People in Britain talk about a football mania. People are obsessed with playing soccer. America doesn't go down that line. It chooses a game more akin to rugby, a handling game, which is then referred to time and time in the records as the Boston game. i.e. they're pointing to this ball and this game on the common as the thing that will become American football. So as it were, yes, Walter Camp does all the work, changing the rules and making it identifiably American football, but in a way what they're trying to suggest is what comes before Walter Camp, us, and our ball.
There's a little bit of interventionist history, let's say. Like, I mean, if you're looking up at these images, we have our round ball, right? and it's a very kind of, it's somewhat oblong, but it's basically round. The memorial, as part of the memorialization, they put, look at that ball.
And the next bit.
What's going on? Look, why is that ball looks like a football.
Well, it does, doesn't it? It doesn't look very round to you, does it? You'll see here, now, the round ball goes from round to, on the monument, when it's erected in 1925, the anniversary being Friday this week, November 21st, 2025, the ball shifts, as you see. It goes from a oval ball to a soccer ball, and now back to an American oval ball. So there's an interesting story here. It's also all wrapped up in memorialization and how we understand and reinterpret history in many senses as a, history as a palimpsest, as something that is written and rewritten on top of itself. And the monument is a wonderful example of that. So in 1925, when these men, and keeping in mind these are all old men who were born in the 1840s and early 50s, and most of the men that were in this social group have all passed away by then. There's very few of them left in 1920, and they're all in their 70s and into their 80s. And so they have donated their ball and their material to the museum for posterity, right, to help give themselves a place in history, as Mike, you were saying. And then in 1925, something interesting happens, which is in the early part of the year, and I think it's in March. Yale's Walter Camp passes away. It's a big surprise. It's national news. If you look at the newspapers all across the country, it is front page news everywhere in the country. Walter Camp, the father of American football. And so, Yale, New Haven, is given a strong place in the story. Obviously, for Boston Brahmin society, that must have irked, I think, Boston Brahmin in some way. It must have rubbed Harvard people the wrong way. And so the news of this comes across the Back Bay at this point, and the remaining men, there's about 5 of them, who Mike and I have called the Monument Men. They're the ones who are orchestrating this memorialization. And they come together to put together a monument at this point in the fall of 1925. And it's something that happens very, very quickly, because over the course of the summer of 1925, everyone in the country is deciding to fund a national memorial for American football, college football, which, remembering at this point, is an amateur game, right? It's not the professional NFL, which doesn't exist at all in the way that we interpret it today, or that we know it today. And so in 1925, you have a national memorial that is being fundraised all across the country by colleges, literally across the colleges and universities across the country, paying to honor the father of American football, who is not from Boston. He's from New Haven. And so this becomes a little bit of and let's say, inter-city, inter-university rivalry. And so the men here in 1925, they say, but we have a ball that goes back. We donated it, but we must be first, shouldn't we? Boston, we know that Boston is first, isn't it? 1920, keeping in mind the contextualization here, 1925 is 5 years after the massive Plymouth Tercentenary celebrations that happened in 1920, celebrating 1620, right? So there is a growing sense of Boston as the origin point for America, the origin point of liberty, the origin point of American identity. All of this is wrapped. So why would Boston not be first in football, in sport? And so they put up the monument in 1925. There's a bit of a spat. I won't go into details because it's fun to read in the book about what goes on the monument. But they decide to put an oval ball, not the round ball, because that would be somewhat problematic, wouldn't it? If you put a round ball in a monument in 1925 to say we're the founders of American football, but we have a round ball. Now, everybody in the late 19th century knew that balls were round and everybody played with it. Even Walter Camp, his biography, actually talks about there's a chapter called The Black Rubber Round Ball. So everybody knew that round balls are round, and it's only later that ball shape changed. But again, that's part of the codification and the change in the evolving rules. But then you get to the monument moment where they put an oval ball, and maybe I'll pause there.
Interesting. But they find, actually, that controlling history and controlling the narrative of origins is maybe not quite so easy as they might want it to be. What happens that, how does, it sort of seems like you have these powerful men who have a very strong sense of themselves and their place in history, and their city's place in history. But at some point, like, the narrative slips the leash. Can you tell us a little bit about what happens to the story of this game and this ball?
I can do that. Just one thing about the monument on Boston Common I think is important to allow into your head. It's the only monument on Boston Common put up by living people in honor of themselves. That's a lot of ego. But if you think about most monuments on Boston Common, they're military, political people who were dead, so the city was honoring them. Whereas these group of men, because of their connections, because of their class, can rock up to the relevant authorities and say, hey, we want to do a monument because we invented football. And the city says, fine. And I think the language is quite interesting on the monument. What it claims is the Oneida Football Club, which is a football club they belonged to as boys in the 1860s, was the first organized football club in the United States. So again, to unpack that, we've got a round ball, we know a round ball. You're claiming you're the first organized football club. What does that mean? If you're the first, are you just standing around waiting for the second team to turn up? And that's why the ball's quite interesting with the gold lettering, because while it is the crest of the Oneida Football Club, which is only used twice in its history, it lists the names of the school it played against, which meant two teams existed at the same time, so you can't be first. But again, it's the idea that what you're doing is you're claiming football. But which football are you claiming? Are you claiming specifically the one you played between 1862 and 1865, and your goal line was never crossed, it says in the monument? Or are you rather cheekily, by putting the ball you didn't play with, an American football, on the monument, are you claiming actually the lineage is somehow the Oneida Football Club to colleges agreeing an intercollegiate form, to camp adapting it? Therefore, we were first, we invented it, it's a Boston game, thank you very much, case closed.
It's one step from Saltonstall to Patrick Mahomes.
Yes.
You know?
Maybe I'll just pick up the story from there, because this slide illustration is precisely kind of what you were getting at, Louisa. The evolution of the ball, the story from the oval to the round then, once these men are all dead by the end of the 1930s, the last of the monument men dies, Garrett Smith Miller, he's the captain, his portrait is at the back of the room, thankfully brought to us by Noble and Greenhouse School, that's from their archives actually, and he dies in 1937. And their memory is essentially no longer theirs anymore. And so that's where, posterity can play fun tricks on history. That's what history is, really, isn't it? And at this point, the monument just continues to exist on Boston Common. Nobody really noticed. I mean, I'm curious how many of you have actually seen this monument. Probably many of you. Some of you have, I'm sure. But most people have no idea what this monument is. It's just there. You walk by it. And that's essentially its existence for the next 30, 40 years, except that it is linked to a club that has a round ball that's on display at Otis House for all of this period after the 1920s. And there is a community in the soccer community at this point, which is growing particularly after the Second World War. And then once we get to the 1970s and 1960s and 70s, where soccer as a game really starts to boom, it becomes a youth game, which, how many of you here had children or grandchildren that played youth soccer in Massachusetts, right? So that game is looking for a legitimate American narrative, an origin story. And it happens to be that the ball, which is round, is sitting in a museum of New England and Boston first. So, you can look at the monument and say, well, all right, well, that's interesting. But the ball actually was round, so maybe they were playing soccer. And so what happens in the 1960s and 70s is the American soccer community reappropriates, in a sense, this story and says, well, actually, but maybe the story is truly the origins of soccer in the United States. And so this comes to a head, if you will, I'll fast forward through the 1980s. The ball goes on loan to the National Soccer Hall of Fame for much of the 1980s into the 1990s, and it's on display in Oneida, New York, which happens to be very close to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Cooperstown. And the National Soccer Hall of Fame at this point, as we're coming into and out of the 1994 World Cup, so for those of you who remember the World Cup in Boston in 1994, there was a big soccer event in Boston at this point. And the monument is in a state of disrepair. It's really worn. It needs to be refurbished. And the National Soccer Hall of Fame at this point writes to the city and said, well, you know, we would like to offer to take care of the monument. And keeping in mind that this monument, you know, it essentially belongs to no one anymore. It belongs to the city and the Friends of the Public Garden. And so at this point, the National Soccer Hall of Fame says, we will restore the monument. So it's very clear. The city knows. They say, the ball was round, there must have been some issue. We will restore the monument, but we'll carve it back to what the round ball is, because that matches the ball in the museum. Makes perfect sense. And so that is done in 1996. And that ball, the ball continues to be in the National Soccer Hall of Fame. It is recalled by Historic New England in 2005, I believe. At which point, the 2000s become an interesting debate between the soccer and the American football community. Who owns the monument, really? And at this point, there is a concerned citizen of Boston, a man named Tom McGrath, who is very keen to see this monument restored to its original sense in 1925, because he says, yes, fine, the ball was round, but the monument as it was made was oval. So there is a campaign that is put together through the early 2000s, and it finishes in 2014 with a project with the Friends of the Public Garden, and they recarve the monument back to its original form. Now, the ultimate question is sort of, what are we memorializing? What are we commemorating here? Is it one game or the other, one code of football that exists, another code that didn't exist? It's complex, and that shows also how we revisit and reinterpret material history.
I have so many things I want to pick up from that, but one of them is I had asked why this matters, and listening to you, and part of me wants to answer my question by saying it doesn't actually matter very much. This is like a ridiculous argument over carving. And the other part of me wants to say, here we are in 2025, and the stories we tell about our past matter very much, and in fact maybe matter more than ever. And here we are. What did you find yourself, as you're sitting in this beautiful reading room, paging through history, did you find yourself ever thinking ahead to the present day, to the eve of our, 250th celebration, thinking about how this informs the kind of memorialization that is taking place right now and what the stakes are?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, obviously in recent years, statues have fallen in many places. And I think there's been a really good debate around what statues are for, what they symbolize. Do we want them? If they symbolize something that we now see as negative from the past. And I think this...
False,
Yeah. And I think this decision-making process where the men originally themselves put an American football on their monument, even though they played with a round ball, then years later, the soccer authorities basically clean it up and rechisel it so it's definitely a soccer ball, where concerned citizen realizes and gets it changed back to its original form, there is a so what moment. It's a monument on Boston Common, who cares? But I think it's more the idea of the authenticity, that what you're allowing for by having it is in its original form, rather than just saying, they played with a round ball, the round ball on the monument, we'll leave it like that. You're actually saying, no, we're putting this back in the state it was in 1925. And the point of the monument in 1925 is these men, by putting an American football on that monument, are making a claim for some level of ownership. And I think whether it's right or wrong, whether they're being playful, you have to acknowledge that. And I think within that sense, it's when we think about the 250 and we think about monuments around cities like Boston and Boston Common, I think it's a really interesting monument because it does have a particular class peculiarity in Boston. but it's a monument that celebrates fun, friendship, early sport, social, cultural history. It's not one that just celebrates war and politics. And actually, I think that's quite important, that we're acknowledging that on Boston Common, and we can argue long into the night about what the game they were playing, I acknowledge that, we don't know. But it's a fact, it captures a moment in time where young men, young elite men, taking exams to try and get to Harvard, regularly with other schoolboys across Boston, spent a couple of hours in the afternoon playing football, and that matters.
And they were doing it in such extreme times, right?
Yes.
I mean, the backdrop of the Civil War is something that it touched their numbers, it touched their brothers and their fathers and their mothers and the players themselves. And so, I think what you say is very moving, actually, and something that it's easy for us to forget. I mean, sometimes, I write about sports, and when I was in my 20s, I decided I wanted to be a serious writer and, write about war and politics. And then I started writing about sports for fun, and I realized, oh, wait, no, this is about being human, right? So I'm curious, as you reflect on how we are choosing or not choosing, in many cases not choosing, to memorialize our history, do you think that we should be making more space for what some people see as trivial, but are expressions of our more playful natures?
I personally think it's important.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to that Civil War moment, so one of the team members is Huntington Wolcott, brother of Roger Wolcott, and he, age 17, signs up for the Union Army and fights, contracts a disease and dies. And his teammates go to the house to look at the coffin, and Wolcott's mother makes a speech that a few of them remember and write down, which is, in this post-conflict Civil War just come to an end, in this post-conflict world, you young men need to do serious work. You need to lead this country. You need to rethink how we're doing things. You need to be men of commerce, of politics, of education. And in a way, it's a very poignant moment because one of their number, a 17-year-old boy, has died in a war or because of a war. The mother has looked forward to what the next generation should be doing. And in the context of the football story, she's almost telling them, put your toys away. You've got to grow up now. And to me, that's quite a sort of important moment about how their world moves on. 75% of them do go to Harvard. By 1890, half of them are millionaires. They do very well for themselves. And yet, when they're down to the last few of them alive, and they are very old men, of all the things, and many of them have real achievements in their life, what do they choose to commemorate? That moment before they were adults, that moment of play. And I think the one thing you can talk to this, Kevin, it's also a monument to friendship.
It's also a monument to a more positive version of the future, right? So because what is happening in the years following this game, right? As you say, there are these groups of people who are coming together to write rules by which they will all abide, right? And they will compete in a still very dangerous sport. And at the end of the day, what is the romantic ideal of sport? What happens? They shake hands, right? So one of the things that is happening is this sort of like suggestion, which is sometimes taken too far, that the sport offers us a way out of our worst instincts, sometimes our way into our worst instincts. But one of the things, though, that delights me is that you have these very self-serious men who I've already claimed are quite petty at times, and the ego, absolutely. On the other hand, they're not only remembering themselves as men who once played, but there's still like a playfulness about them. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit, because for as much as like the self-seriousness of this monument, they have a bit of self-deprecation about them too, right?
They certainly do. Mike, I'm glad you mentioned the monument of friendship, because that is perhaps a perfect segue to this. I'll highlight, I think it was the next slide, where we have these are extracts from Dixwell, Epis Dixwell's diaries, where it's the next image, where he records actually Huntington Walcott, one of his students, going off to war and dying, and it's just there, mentioned right there. Those are the top is when he goes off to war, and the other boys give him a sword, they give him a belt, and this is just Dixwell's note that says Huntington Walcott died. And so we have the reality, the brutal reality of war that marks their childhood, and in that sense, it is interesting to see that sport and leisure is something that they are able to carry through them all throughout their lives. A lot of their correspondence, some of which is here in the James DeWolf Lubbock collection, is wonderful. They write to each other as old men, dear teammate. That's what they write. They say, dear teammate. Beloved teammate. So there's a sense of friendship there that is linked to this old boyhood relationship, and the playfulness, I suppose, maybe one of the things that Mike and I debated about the book was whether to call it a hoax, because when you see all of this stuff about a ball, the changing shape, and how they've maybe reimagined their own history, is it all a hoax? We'll let you decide. But there is a playfulness to it, and part of that is then ultimately brought through James DeWolf Lubbock. He's a poet. He writes a lot for the Boston Evening Transcript. One of his poems is on display upstairs as well. It's an ode to the 5 old friends. And they gather after the monument is built, and Lovett writes a final poem. It's the last one that we have in the collection in 1927 that is called A Pilgrimage, which is a wonderful idea for Boston, right? A pilgrimage, and making mention to the city upon a hill. And this poem reveals an interesting conversation that these men have with their old ball about the building of a monument. And I perhaps won't give too much away, but there is a wonderful playfulness where they finally admit as old men, maybe we've been a little loose and fun with the truth and with our artifacts, with our material history, with the preservation, with the story. But what we've all done is we've all done it for friendship, because it's the thing that has kept them together all the way into their elderly days.
Conspiracies,
Yeah.
nothing like it for cementing friendships. I think at this point it is 6:46, and so we're going to open it up to questions.
Hi, I'm Jim Siegel, a member of Mass Historical Society. Thank you. I've really enjoyed listening to you. So there is also tangentially a story about Harvard's contribution to football as it is now. At least in the Harvard program, it says this at a football game, that it was a very deadly game in the early 1900s. And maybe you mention it in your book. I haven't read the book. Do you mention it? Yeah. Do you want to talk about it? The fact that Harvard Stadium made the present game?
Yes, the violence associated with early football, particularly in the 1880s and 90s, and then again around the early 1900s, so 1903, 1907, in that span of time is when they are, particularly Walter Camp and the rules committee at this point, they are trying to regulate violence out of the sport, because there's a lot of newspaper evidence that talks about, oh my goodness, it's all of these people having concussions. And Lovett himself, actually, in his 1906 Old Boston Boys, he comments on the game in 1906 and says, I don't even recognize this game, that it's almost Roman gladiators fighting, and that's the language he uses. And so there is a reform that happens in the game, in college football at this point, in the late 19th century and early 20th, that makes the game what it is in the 1920s. Introduction of a forward pass rule, which comes precisely after when they've done this. But there is a sense of violence, which is very different from the boyhood game that they had in the 1960s, which is just boys running around, kicking a ball, running with a ball, tackling each other, exhibiting kind of all their testosterone on Boston Common.
Is it on? What the Harvard program says is that Teddy Roosevelt called all the football people to the White House and they said, you've got to stop this. You have two choices. Either widen the field so you can run more like Canada, or have a forward pass. And Harvard says, we just built Harvard Stadium. We can't widen the field. So it went to the forward pass instead, which also, what I assume, affected the shape of the ball as they make it more and more spiral.
That's important when they get to the point of the memorial in the mid-1920s. Because of those reforms, the game of college football post-First World War is probably the biggest sporting happening across the US every weekend. So when they claim that ball, they're claiming, you know, the game of the moment has been, as you say, tidied up, cleaned up, reformed.
So this has been a fascinating talk. I've got to say, I used to actually teach a seminar on athletic history, and I never knew that memorial was there in Boston Common. I lived in Boston my whole life. I've got a different kind of Harvard-related connection, and I gather we really don't know what rules or, if any, this game had. But I'm trying to understand the transition from the freshman-sophomore brutal game that the Harvard eventually banned for whatever it was, a decade or 20 years, and then reluctantly Eliot allowed to be restored. And this game that's happening on Boston Common. I mean, you suggested that what they were playing on Boston Common was less violent than the game that was being played between the Harvard classes. This was not intercollegiate. This was a freshman-sophomore rivalry, and then some other football game reappeared at Harvard. So there was three kind of games there. I'm trying to figure out what the connection between those three is.
I'm going to ask you to reveal the name of that very brutal, violent game that was outlawed.
So Bloody Monday.
Bloody Monday.
Right, it was called Bloody Monday. I think it's important, however, to make a distinction between the general sporting culture that was going on in the 1840s and 1850s. People were running around and playing games. They're playing baseball as well. And we didn't talk about rowing. I wish we would have talked about rowing, but rowing was the big college sport at this point as well, but along with baseball. But the ban, which comes in 1860, is to ban particularly this hazing ritual, which is freshmen versus sophomores, and it's violent. It's also imbued with lots of alcohol. And so in a moment, surprise, surprise, where society is dealing with questions of temperance, and there's a huge social reform movement with respect to that. And football, this game, is in part associated with that kind of debauchery. So there is a sense of, from the school authorities, we need to get rid of it, and that's across all of the universities at this point. It's not just a Boston thing. It's up into Dartmouth. It's out into Cornell. It's down to Columbia. Everybody's banning it. But what they're banning is they're banning a specific activity. Now there is a sense in newspapers that people are still playing kicking games, and it's important perhaps to make a distinction between the age groups, because those who are in college, they're a little bit older. So you can imagine the difference between a 13, 14, 15-year-old who's running around playing games on Boston Common and someone who has the muscle mass of a 19 and 20, 21-year-old. Now, the games will be different by virtue just of those playing. So there's a continuity of playing games, but that particular phenomena is absolutely it's put aside by the collegiate administration until 1870.
I think it's also important that once you get into that period of the 1870s and the colleges are trying to decide what game they're going to play, is it going to be soccer, is it going to be rugby, is it somewhere in between? There's, first of all, many of the men who are involved in early Harvard football in the 1870s talk about the games on Boston Common. Not necessarily the Oneida game, but they've been to other schools in the area. They've seen it, they've played it. So there is a continuity there. One of the children of one of these boys we've been talking about, he plays on the Harvard football team. So, you know, if it's your dad explaining to you what game you played 20 years ago, that's very real, that's very alive. So I think it's interesting that you look at the ban in 1860 and then figuring out the football problem in the 1870s, what game are we going to play, locally within this city. The only continuum is this old schoolboy game on Boston Common, and I think that's why Harvard's view of the kind of game they want to play is very, very strong. Whereas if you look at Yale are flim-flamming. They're like, oh, this new game soccer, this game rugby, you know, what are we doing? Whereas Harvard is like, no, we are rooted to this version of our game.
And it's perhaps not an invented tradition in that sense. It's a true tradition of Boston.
As a third-generation graduate of Princeton University, I grew up with the history that Rutgers and Princeton played the first modern football game. Perhaps that modern is the one qualifier that may be, would they have been playing a Walter Camp game, or was this off the reservation from the Harvard and Yale perspective?
Thank you for the question, because it also links to issues of anniversaries and how things are commemorated. One of the fascinating stories in right before the men here in Boston donate their ball and they have a monument and all of this is in 1919 is a interesting anniversary to these famous 1869 games between Princeton and Rutgers. What were they playing? Well, it appears they're playing a far more kicking-based game, which looks more like, I mean, the problem of this is always a problem of historical perspective. Are we looking backwards and trying to interpret the past from our present moment, or are we trying to understand where they were, what they were doing as they were walking forwards? One of the ideas that we have in at least from a sport history perspective is until about the 1870s, there is a common sense that football, so foot space ball, is one game. It's everybody plays it. Now it has a bit of kicking, it has a bit of handling, it depends on the scoring, it's a local-based game. It's only as these childhood, boyhood games get regulated and codified by then adults that we start to have a distinction between different types of football, and then it's American football and it's Gaelic football. Mike has written about the history of Gaelic football. There's Australian rules football. There's all sorts of different footballs, but they all have this common origin in a common early universal game. And particularly for these men, I think one of the things that we grappled with was understanding that they grew up in a world where there was only one kind of football, and it just evolved. It's our sort of later teleological perspective where we want to tell the story from the past towards where we are, where we can play with the truth. So maybe I'll stop there. Are we good? Oh.
You brought it up, so I'll point up. 100 years after that first Princeton-Rutgers football game in 1869, was the first intercollegiate ultimate frisbee game, Rutgers versus Princeton. And your history of this football and ultimate sort of started in 1968. So we're about 70 years in, and I was one of the early players in ultimate way back when. So it's about the same age period, and sort of the rumors and the legends from back then and how it comes today is very similar. The game hasn't changed as much, but it's kind of interesting, a lot of the connections of the people who played who still stay in connection with each other. So,
Yes. Yes.
Be the second living person to have a monument. You know, I just want to circle back though, because I think one of the things you say is quite interesting in some ways because of the fact of these like bloody, literally capital B Bloody Monday games. Not only do they want to claim a history, but they want to claim a legitimate history, right? I mean, there's a sort of kind of anxiety in some way, I wonder, about, oh no, are they going to look back and see the origins of the game in this thing that we banned, you know, or that caused all these deaths, you know, in the early 1900s? I mean, there's something so innocent about this one game that people seem so eager to hold on to. And there's something at once false about that and also so true, I think, as we look at where we are, you know, in this important anniversary moment.
So just to perhaps to close this, we wanted to share with you some frosty verse. You'll probably recognize this as we go. We put together a little poem that summarizes the entire story, so I'll just quickly read it out to you. As you know, we talked about two different codes, two different games of sport, a soccer code and an American football code. So this is the code not taken. Two codes diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry he could not claim them both. Being one ball, oblong it stood, and looked down Boston Common as far as he could, where hid in a sphere in the undergrowth. Graven stone pigskin, just as fair, having perhaps the better claim, because for gridiron football, the 20s did care. With 94, the passing there had worn the tablet to soccer fame. 5 old friends in camp's shadow yet lay, and on Brahmin memory had trodden black. Oneida yet first for another day, as Beacon Hill breeds to the back bay. I doubted if round should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a smile, somewhere pages and pages hence. 2 games devised in a yellow wood, and I spied the club's poetic guile. A luncheon roast made all the difference. So that's the...
Thank you very much, Kevin, Mike, and Louisa, for this really thoughtful and wonderful discussion. And thank you to all of you, our in-person audience, as well as friends who are joining us online. I encourage all of you to visit our website to see what is coming up next in the MHS program lineup. And we are really grateful for our members who help make all of this possible. If you are not yet one, we encourage you to think about becoming one. So thank you very much. Kevin and Mike will be signing books in the back of the room for folks who are here in person. If you are online and you'd like to buy a copy, we encourage you to visit your local independent bookstore. It's a great gift, it's a great history, and it's a great book. Thank you very much for joining us.